The air smelled of lilies and old secrets. The funeral home was crowded, not with tears, but with silent judgments and well-pressed suits. Evelyn Hart stood near the front pew, her black dress clinging to her like a second skin. Her hands were folded tightly in front of her, knuckles pale against each other, as she stared at the closed casket. Inside lay Frederick Hart, her father-in-law, the towering patriarch of the Hart family and a man whose approval she'd spent decades trying to earn. Beside her stood Richard, her husband of 30 years. His face was the mask of composed grief, polished and practiced. Evelyn watched him closely, too closely perhaps. She had begun watching him differently lately, measuring every glance, every sigh, every shift of tone in his voice. Something had changed. Or maybe something had always been there, hiding beneath the folds of routine. Then the door opened, and the air changed. She saw her before she heard her name. Tall, elegant, with silvering chestnut hair pulled into a loose bun. The years had been kind to her, perhaps too kind. Evelyn's breath caught as her eyes locked with the woman walking in. For a second, the decades folded in on themselves. Grace Monroe. It had been over 30 years, yet her presence still stirred something dormant in Evelyn. It was not just recognition. It was memory, raw, unresolved, sharp. Grace gave a polite nod as she moved to sign the guest book. She wore a navy blue coat over a black blouse, understated yet unmistakably graceful. She didn't belong to this world of corporate stoicism and tight-lipped condolences. She never had. Evelyn's mind whirled. What was she doing here? How did she know Frederick? Did she come to pay respects, or to stir the past? She glanced at Richard. He was staring at Grace. It was only a second, but Evelyn caught it. That flicker of tension in his jaw, the way he shifted his feet, the tightness in his eyes. She had known this man since they were 20. She could read him better than anyone. And in that moment, she knew something was wrong. Grace moved toward the row where extended family sat and chose a seat with a direct view of the front. Her eyes met Evelyn's again, just for a heartbeat, but it was enough. Something passed between them. An echo of a conversation never had, of choices never made. After the service, Evelyn stepped out into the cold sunlight. The late autumn air bit at her skin, but she needed space. Space to think, to breathe, to put names to the unease in her chest. Richard approached her, fixing the collar of his coat. "Are you all right?" he asked, voice gentle. "Fine," she replied, her gaze never leaving the parking lot. "Grace Monroe was here," he added after a beat, as if it were a passing comment. "I saw. She and Dad worked together once. She did some writing for one of the foundation's grants a few years ago." Evelyn turned to him. His face was calm. Too calm. She nodded, saying nothing. Back at home, Evelyn sat in her kitchen, staring at a teacup gone cold. Her mind drifted backward, to a summer in Maine when she was 19. A writing program at a lakeside campus. Long afternoons reading poetry, long nights whispering stories under moonlight. And Grace. She remembered the way Grace had looked at her, like she saw something Evelyn had yet to recognize in herself. There had been touches, brushes of hands, lingering eyes. A kiss once, stolen behind the dormitory after too much wine. Then Evelyn pulled away, afraid of what it meant, afraid of what her parents would say. And just like that, Grace disappeared. They never spoke again. Until today. Evelyn reached for her phone. She opened the funeral guest list her sister-in-law had emailed. Grace's name was there, scribbled in neat cursive. Beneath it, an address. Monroe Writing Center, Branford, Connecticut. Branford. It was only 20 minutes from here. She opened a browser and searched the center. The first image that popped up was Grace, smiling radiant, standing beside a plaque that read, "Writing is the soul's second breath." Evelyn stared at the screen for a long time. Then her phone buzzed. A message from her daughter, Sarah. "Hey Mom, I'm staying late at the center tonight. Dr. Monroe is giving us feedback on our short stories. Don't wait up." Evelyn blinked. Dr. Monroe? Her fingers froze over the screen. Sarah. Her daughter. Her only child. A brilliant literature major in her final year at Yale. She was studying under Grace. Going to her writing center. Seeing her, every week? She swallowed hard. A storm was forming inside her, a quiet, growing hurricane of realization and dread. She stood up from the table and moved to Richard's study. He wasn't home. She checked his calendar. He had a client dinner that night. Again. Lately, there had been many of those. Evelyn sat at his desk. Her hands shook slightly as she opened the top drawer and rifled through it. Beneath a pile of papers, she found a receipt. A lunch bill from a small bistro in Branford. 2 meals. Wine. Last Thursday. She sat there, receipt in hand, her breathing shallow. Grace Monroe wasn't a ghost from the past. She was here. Now. And Evelyn's life was about to come undone. Evelyn didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed beside Richard, the man she had built a life with, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing while her own thoughts spiraled out of control. She stared at the ceiling, wide awake, with the receipt from Branford still folded in her robe pocket. At 3 a.m., she got out of bed and went to the kitchen. The hardwood floor felt cold against her feet, grounding her in reality even as her thoughts drifted into territory she didn't yet know how to name. She poured herself a glass of water, stood at the counter, and remembered every little detail she had ignored for months. The client dinners that ran later than usual. The sudden interest in new cologne. The text messages he smiled at and never explained. The distance. The silence. The walls he had built without saying a word. And now Grace. The next morning, Evelyn didn't bring it up. She made coffee like she always did, set out 2 mugs. Richard came downstairs in his crisp navy suit, briefcase in hand, kissed her cheek like he always did. She smiled like she always did. But something inside her had changed. After he left, she waited 30 minutes, then called her daughter. "Hey Mom," Sarah said, her voice light. "Everything okay?" "I was just wondering, this writing center you're going to, is that part of school?" "Not officially," Sarah replied. "Dr. Monroe invited a few of us to a private workshop series. She said I had potential. It's actually been really great. She's brilliant." Evelyn's heart sank. "She ever talk about your father?" Evelyn asked. Sarah laughed. "What? No. Why would she?" "No reason," Evelyn said quickly. "Just curious." She hung up, feeling like she had asked the wrong question, or maybe the right one too late. Later that afternoon, Evelyn drove to Branford. The Monroe Writing Center sat in a converted Victorian house, ivy curling along the brick facade. It was charming, idyllic, like the kind of place people went to find themselves in words. She parked across the street, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she watched the building. Students came and went. A man carried a stack of books inside. A woman exited with a cup of tea. Then Grace appeared. She stepped onto the porch, speaking with a tall man in his 40s. She laughed at something he said, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She looked relaxed. Alive. And then Evelyn saw it, a brief glance, over the man's shoulder, to a black sedan pulling into the lot. Richard. He stepped out of the car, casual in a sweater and slacks.
No briefcase.
No tie. Evelyn watched from the shadows of her car as Grace and Richard embraced. It wasn't romantic, not quite. Not overt. But it was too familiar. Too practiced. The kind of hug that wasn't a first. It was a gesture built on history, something shared in secret. Evelyn felt the heat rise to her face, a buzzing in her ears. She couldn't breathe. She leaned back, hiding from view, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure they could hear it from across the street. He was seeing her. Her husband. With Grace. The confirmation was both shattering and clarifying. She waited until they disappeared inside the building, then turned the ignition and drove away, her hands trembling on the wheel. Back home, she sat on the edge of the bathtub and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Not much had changed in 30 years, at least on the surface. Her hair was a bit grayer, her skin lined with the kind of wisdom people paid for in quotes and therapy. But her eyes still looked too willing to believe the best in people. She undressed slowly, stepped into the shower, and let the water scald her skin. As she reached for the shampoo, she froze. A smell. Not her own lavender shampoo. Something musky, woodsy, laced with spice. She grabbed Richard's shampoo bottle and brought it to her nose. Amber smoke. The same scent from his shirt last week. The one she had dismissed as a new cologne. But it wasn't his. It was hers. Grace's. She remembered it now. Grace had always worn something warm and smoky, a scent Evelyn could never quite place, something that lingered in books and letters she'd once tucked away. She stood under the water, letting it hit her face, letting the betrayal seep into her bones. This wasn't just about a flirtation or a passing weakness. This was something deliberate. That night, she confronted him, but not directly. Not yet. She sat across from him at dinner, silent while he talked about a city council vote and how the mayor was stepping down. He never once asked how her day was. He hadn't in months. When he cleared the dishes, she leaned back in her chair and asked, "Do you ever miss college?" Richard blinked. "What do you mean?" "Just, that time in our lives. When things were simpler." He shrugged. "I suppose. But life's better now, isn't it?" "Is it?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment, wary. "Is something wrong?" She shook her head.
No.
"Just thinking." He nodded and left the room. She didn't follow. Later that evening, while he showered, Evelyn opened his briefcase. She didn't know what she expected, maybe nothing. But inside, she found a second phone. Slim. Black. Hidden beneath a legal folder. It was locked, but the screen lit up with a notification. One new message from G. Her heart stilled. She put the phone back carefully, precisely, and closed the briefcase. Back in the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of wine, staring out into the night. He was cheating. With Grace. The same woman she had once pushed away. The same woman who had once whispered to her under starlight, "I'll never forget you." Evelyn thought she had buried that part of her life, the one that ached in secret and never got closure. But it had come back. Not as memory, but as consequence. The past wasn't past. It was here. And it was sleeping beside her. The past has a way of knocking, even when you've bolted every door. Evelyn sat on the porch the following morning, her coffee untouched, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if it might offer answers. The second phone was still in Richard's briefcase. The message from G. still burned behind her eyes. But it wasn't just the betrayal that consumed her, it was the identity of the other woman. Grace Monroe. A name Evelyn hadn't allowed herself to think about for over 30 years. Now, her daughter adored her. Her husband saw her in secret. And Evelyn. Evelyn remembered her too well. It was the summer of 1989. Evelyn had just turned 19, ambitious, smart, the kind of girl who colored within the lines but longed quietly to step outside of them. She'd earned a scholarship to a prestigious writing retreat in Maine, a sprawling lakeside campus tucked between forests and time. That summer was all golden light and paperbacks, slow mornings and poetry read aloud under willow trees. And then there was Grace. Grace was already 21. Confident, radiant, a second-year literature major at NYU. She had the kind of presence that turned heads without trying, that filled up a room without raising her voice. Her stories were electric, her laughter rare but unforgettable. Evelyn had watched her from across writing circles, fascinated. They were paired for a 2-week critique project. That was how it started. Late nights in the library. Shared jokes. Side glances. A hand that lingered a second too long over a notebook. One night, Evelyn remembered, they'd stayed up working on a joint short story in the common room. The storm outside had cut the power. They sat by candlelight, reading lines aloud, drinking cheap red wine from paper cups. "You always hold back," Grace had said then, her voice quiet. Evelyn looked at her. "I don't think I do." "You do," Grace replied, eyes on her. "Not just in writing. In everything." They'd gone silent after that. Not awkward, charged. Then Grace had leaned forward. Just slightly. Evelyn hadn't moved away. When their lips met, it was tentative. Unsure. But honest. She remembered the warmth of it. The terror. The want. The confusion. But the next morning, Evelyn avoided her. Pretended nothing had happened. She told herself it was a phase, a mistake, an experiment. When the retreat ended, she said goodbye like Grace was any other classmate. She hadn't spoken to her again. Not until the funeral. Back in the present, Evelyn ran her fingers along the rim of her coffee mug. That kiss had haunted her for years, not because it was shameful, but because it had been real. More real than anything she'd let herself have back then. And she had turned her back on it. On Grace. Now Grace was here, entangled with the life Evelyn had built from the ruins of denial. Was it revenge? Or something more complicated? That afternoon, Evelyn visited the library downtown. She pulled up every article, interview, and press release she could find on the Monroe Writing Center and Grace Monroe herself. There were dozens of mentions over the past few years. Grace had received awards for her work with underprivileged youth, had published essays in respected journals, had been nominated for a National Teaching Award. But it was one article in particular that caught Evelyn's eye. A feature in a local magazine, dated 18 months ago. There was a photo of Grace in the courtyard of the writing center, standing next to none other than Richard Hart. The article celebrated a partnership between Grace's nonprofit and the Hart Family Foundation, an initiative supposedly created by Frederick Hart to support educational outreach. Richard had been the director of the foundation since 2017. The caption read, "Local educator Dr. Grace Monroe joins forces with Hart Foundation President Richard Hart to foster creative writing programs for youth." Evelyn stared at the photo for a long time. So that's how it started. Richard had met Grace through the foundation. The writing center was less than a half hour away. The timeline lined up too perfectly. He'd begun working with her over a year ago. That meant the affair, if it was one, wasn't recent. It was long. Deliberate. It had been built quietly, like a second life. And all this time, Evelyn had been here. Cooking dinners. Planning holidays. Keeping a home alive that her husband had already begun to leave. She walked home from the library, letting the cold wind bite at her face. Her thoughts were not chaotic anymore. They were measured. Focused. She wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. She wanted it. That night, while Richard showered, Evelyn stood at the kitchen counter and retrieved the second phone from his briefcase. It was still locked. She sat down, stared at it, trying to think. Then she remembered the passcode to his old tablet. Their anniversary. 723. She tried it. The phone unlocked. The message from G was still at the top. G. Are you okay? Yesterday felt heavy. She scrolled up. Dozens of messages. Months of them. Photos. Inside jokes. Plans to meet. And then, words that stopped her cold. G. You still haven't told her, have you? Ah. It's complicated. She doesn't suspect anything. G. You said that 3 months ago. Ah. I know. I'm just waiting for the right time. G. She deserves to know. We both do. Evelyn read the words over and over. He wasn't just cheating. He was planning to leave her. She scrolled further. A message from Richard, sent only a week ago. R. After the funeral, we'll figure it out. I promise. After the funeral. Frederick Hart's funeral. Evelyn put the phone down and stared at nothing. Now she understood. The funeral wasn't just the end of a life. It had been the signal. The moment Richard had decided to move forward with his second life. With Grace. She placed the phone back exactly where she found it. Then she went to bed. That night, as Richard slipped under the sheets beside her, Evelyn whispered into the darkness, so softly that even she wasn't sure if she'd said it aloud. I knew once what it meant to want you. Now I know what it means to survive you. He didn't stir. But something inside her did. A flicker. A decision. Tomorrow, she would begin her own investigation. Not just of the affair, but of the foundation. Of the money. Of the secrets he thought she couldn't uncover. He had built a new life behind her back. She would dismantle it, quietly, thoroughly, and piece by piece. Evelyn had always been methodical. It was a trait people mistook for gentleness, for patience, for passivity. They thought because she rarely raised her voice and kept her emotions folded beneath layers of calm, she couldn't be dangerous. They were wrong. By the next morning, she had a plan. A quiet one.
No confrontations. No dramatic accusations.
She wasn't ready for a war she didn't understand the scale of. First, she needed proof. Not just of betrayal, but of something deeper. Something she sensed under the surface of Richard's affair, an undercurrent of deceit that had nothing to do with love or lust. Money. Evelyn began with the Hart Foundation. On the surface, it was a standard family-run philanthropic entity. Founded by Frederick Hart in the early 2000s, the foundation provided grants for education, local arts programs, and community health. Richard had taken over operations after his father's health began to decline. Evelyn had always remained at a respectful distance. She attended the annual gala dinners, posed for photographs, wrote thank you cards to donors. But she never handled the paperwork. That had always been Richard's territory. Now she wanted in. She started by logging into the foundation's public-facing grant database. It was easy enough. She still had access as a board member, a role she held in name only. She scanned the list of approved grantees for the past 18 months. There it was. The Monroe Writing Center. 5 grants, each valued between $15,000 and $30,000. The descriptions were vague: Youth Outreach Initiative, Literacy Support Program, Community Writing Labs. All perfectly legitimate on paper. But the dates made her stop. The first grant had been approved 3 weeks after Richard and Grace began texting regularly, according to the phone history she'd read the night before. The pattern was too neat, too aligned. She dug deeper. The most recent grant, dated 2 months ago, was flagged as discretionary. It required board review and co-signatures. Her name was listed under the approval stamp. She had never seen that form in her life. Evelyn stared at the screen. Either someone had forged her signature, or someone had used an old template and simply pasted it in. She printed the documents and filed them in a folder labeled Garden Renovation, just in case Richard happened to open the drawer. Next, she checked their joint financial accounts. At first, nothing looked unusual. Their savings, investments, and home equity lines were as expected. But then she opened Sarah's college fund. It had always been modest, enough to cover a few years of undergrad, but Sarah's scholarships had covered most of the expenses. Evelyn remembered they talked about reallocating the remaining balance towards Sarah's future wedding, or a down payment on her first home. But now, the balance had nearly tripled. $185,000. Transferred in chunks over the past year from one of the foundation's accounts. The memo notes were vague: educational support, family provision, grant-linked allocation. Evelyn felt the first true jolt of fear. The money wasn't just going to Grace. It was being funneled through Sarah. She grabbed her phone and called her daughter. "Hey Mom," Sarah answered, cheerful as always. "What's up?" "Quick question," Evelyn said, keeping her tone casual. "Have you noticed any changes to your education account? The one we opened for you years ago." There was a pause. Yeah, actually. I got a notification about a large deposit last month, but I figured it was just Dad topping it up or something." "Did he say why?" "No. I didn't ask."
Evelyn exhaled slowly. "Do me a favor. Don't touch it for now, okay?"
"Sure.
Everything all right."
Just sorting some paperwork. That's all." She hung up before Sarah could ask more questions. Back at the dining room table, Evelyn laid out her findings: grant applications, bank statements, forged documents. A pattern emerged. Richard had used his position at the foundation to quietly move money. Not enough to trigger a financial audit, but enough to make a difference, especially if the destination was someone he trusted. Grace. The betrayal now had layers. Richard wasn't just having an affair. He was rerouting family money. Using Sarah as a pass-through account.
Forging Evelyn's approval.
And for what? Was he planning to divorce her and set up a new life with Grace? Was Sarah aware?
Complice?
Evelyn didn't want to believe that. Sarah was ambitious, yes. Focused, driven. But she was also loyal, or had been. She was close to her father, always had been.
Maybe too close.
But Evelyn wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. She needed more. The next step was the insurance. She and Richard had taken out life insurance policies years ago, after Sarah was born.
Balanced, équal, simple.
But things had changed. She remembered Richard mentioning a new provider last year. Something about better premiums. She logged into the new portal. The password was the name of their first dog, capitalized. He had always been predictable like that.
The policy loaded.
His new policy was worth $2 million. The beneficiary was listed as Sarah Hart, daughter. Evelyn sat back in her chair. Her name wasn't mentioned. She clicked through the change request history. The update had been made 8 months ago.
Nos notifications. Nos discussions. Just done.
She stared at the screen, her stomach knotting. He was preparing to leave her. Not in a sudden emotional collapse, but in a carefully choreographed exit. Financially insulated.
Legalie airtight.
The kind of exit that takes months of planning. The kind of exit you build while kissing your wife goodnight and thanking her for setting the table. Evelyn closed the laptop and pressed her palms into her eyes. For years, she had kept everything running. Meals, holidays, birthdays, the home, the daughter, the silence. She had kept the life alive. And now, he was preparing to replace her, erase her. She stood up, legs unsteady, and walked to the mirror in the hallway. She looked older than she remembered. Not because of wrinkles, or gray strands, but because of what she now knew. She whispered to her reflection, "He thinks I won't fight back." But she would. Not with rage. With precision. She pulled the garden folder from the drawer, tucked the evidence inside, and locked it in her sewing cabinet. No one touched that cabinet but her. Then she poured herself a glass of water, stood in the kitchen, and waited for Richard to come home. She wouldn't say a word tonight. Not yet. He had built his lie piece by piece. She would dismantle it the same way. By Monday morning, Evelyn was no longer surprised by the idea that everything around her might be a lie. She had begun to view her life like a photograph she had once loved, framed, curated, meant to be admired, but that, under close inspection, was slowly fading, its edges curling, the ink separating from the paper. Still, nothing could have prepared her for the phone call. It came from a blocked number. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something in her gut told her to answer. "Mrs. Hart," a man's voice said, low and deliberate. "Yes." There was a pause. "I don't think your father-in-law is dead." Evelyn gripped the phone tighter. "Who is this?" The man didn't answer the question. "He's at Greenfield Assisted Living, under the name Frederick Allen. You might want to see for yourself." The line went dead. Evelyn stood motionless in the center of her kitchen. The phone still in her hand. The name echoing in her head.
Frederick Allen.
It couldn't be true. Richard had told her Frederick passed in his sleep. That it was quiet, peaceful. She'd been the one to write the obituary. She'd planned the funeral. Held Sarah's hand during the burial. But now, standing there with the silence pressing in around her, Evelyn realized how little of it she had actually seen with her own eyes. She hadn't seen the body. Everything had been handled by the funeral home, the lawyers, Richard. And she had trusted him. 2 hours later, she stood in the parking lot of Greenfield Assisted Living, staring at the modest brick building that housed nearly 100 elderly residents. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her coat tighter around her. Inside, the receptionist greeted her kindly. Evelyn asked to speak with Frederick Allen. The woman typed on her computer, glanced up with a professional smile, and asked her to wait in the visiting lounge. 10 minutes later, a nurse wheeled an old man into the room. He was thinner, paler, but unmistakably Frederick Hart. Evelyn gasped, her body going cold. He looked up at her with tired eyes. "Well," he said, voice rough with age. "I was wondering when someone would find me." She couldn't move. "You're supposed to be dead." He gave a small, bitter laugh. "I know." She sat down slowly across from him. "Why?" He looked around the room as if the walls themselves might be listening. "Because my son wanted me gone. And I wanted out." Evelyn frowned. "That makes no sense." Frederick coughed, cleared his throat. "Richard came to me a year ago. Said the foundation was no longer viable under joint leadership. He wanted full control. I told him no. A few weeks later, I had a fall. Ended up in the hospital. When I came to, everything had been signed over, by me supposedly. Except I didn't sign anything." Evelyn stared. "He forged your documents?" "I can't prove it," he said. "But I know my son. He's been patient, calculated, ever since he was a boy. He thinks the world owes him for what he didn't get. I built a business, and he wanted the reward without the work. Why not go to the police? I tried. But without hard evidence, no one would listen. And Richard made sure to cover his tracks. So I struck a deal with him.
Ide disappear.
Let the world think I died. In exchange, I kept a small portion of my assets and agreed to stay quiet. Evelyn's mouth was dry. Why tell me now? Because he broke the deal, Frederick said flatly. He's draining the foundation. Giving money to that woman, Grace Monroe. I see the transfers. I have someone watching. Why her? Evelyn asked, even though part of her already knew. Frederick hesitated. Years ago, I wanted him to marry her. Not you. The words hit like ice. She came from a family with influence, ambition, connections. But he met you, fell for you instead. I didn't like it, but I didn't stop it. Now I wonder if maybe I should have. Maybe things would have been simpler. Evelyn looked away. So now what? She asked, voice low. Frederick leaned in slightly. I have copies of the original will. The one Richard altered. In that version, the estate is split, between him, you, and someone else. Who? He looked at her. Grace. Evelyn froze. She worked with the foundation briefly. Helped build a literacy program. I admired her work. I meant to honor that. But Richard saw an opportunity. And now he wants to control it all. He already does. Unless someone challenges the current documents. Evelyn took a shaky breath. Why not do it yourself? I'm tired, Frederick said. And I've already lost too much. But he underestimated you. She stared at the old man she had once feared, once tried so hard to please. Now, he was just another casualty in Richard's quiet war for power. Will you help me? He asked. Evelyn stood up slowly.
No.
I'll help myself. That night, Evelyn returned home in a daze. Richard was in the den, sipping a scotch, reading the paper like nothing had changed. How was your day? He asked. She looked at him. A man who had faked his father's death. Who had rewritten a will. Forged documents. Manipulated bank accounts. Lied with the ease of a seasoned actor. She smiled. Peaceful, she said. She went upstairs, locked the door to her sewing room, and opened the cabinet. Inside, she began a new folder. This one she labeled, Frederick Allen, Living Evidence. She slipped in her notes, the printed obituary, and a recording she had secretly made during their conversation. The puzzle was taking shape. One betrayal had become 5. And the man she'd once shared a bed with was no longer just unfaithful. He was dangerous. But now, she had something he didn't. Time. He thought she was behind. But she was catching up. And she was just getting started. Evelyn had always believed that secrets corrode quietly. They seep into the cracks of a home, settle in the corners of laughter and routine, and over time, they distort even the simplest truths. But nothing had prepared her for the possibility that her daughter might be holding one of those secrets too. She stared at the account summary again. Sarah's education fund had ballooned without explanation. Over $180,000. Not a gift. Not an inheritance.
À transfert, deliberate structured, med through the Art Foundation. Trop Richard. The number Allen med Evelyn feel dizzy.
She closed the laptop and looked out the window. Sarah had texted her earlier in the day, saying she'd be home for dinner. Evelyn had suggested it. Casual, warm. A mother wanting to spend time with her daughter. Sarah had agreed without hesitation. Now Evelyn sat at the kitchen island, slicing vegetables for a meal she had no appetite to eat. She moved slowly, deliberately, trying to quiet the tremor in her hands. At 6:30, Sarah walked through the door, cheeks flushed from the cool air, books and a laptop under one arm. She smelled like peppermint shampoo and bookstore paperbacks, still the little girl Evelyn remembered, even as she grew into a young woman with her own edges, her own secrets. Hey Mom, Sarah said, leaning in to kiss her cheek.
Smell amazing.
It's just pasta, Evelyn replied with a smile. I figured we could have a quiet night.
Sounds perfect.
They ate together in the softly lit kitchen. Evelyn asked about classes, professors, the writing center. Sarah answered with ease, her face lighting up when she spoke about Dr. Monroe. She's honestly brilliant, Sarah said. The way she critiques, She sees right through the fluff. I've learned more from her in 6 months than I have from 2 years in college. Evelyn nodded, her fork moving idly through the food on her plate. She ever talk about Dad? Evelyn asked, keeping her voice light. Sarah looked up. What do you mean? I know they work together, Evelyn said. I just wondered if she mentioned him. Professionally. Sarah hesitated for half a second, barely long enough to notice. Not really, she said. I mean, she said he helped get the writing center more funding, but that's about it. Evelyn watched her carefully.
She ever mention me.
No, Sarah said. Why would she? Evelyn didn't answer. They moved on. Dishes were washed, leftovers packed away. Sarah offered to help, but Evelyn insisted she relax. After everything was put in place, Evelyn sat across from her daughter in the living room, a mug of tea in her hands. Can I ask you something? Evelyn said. Sarah looked up. Of course. Did your father ever tell you about the new insurance policy?
Sarah blinked. No. What insurance?
The one that names you as the sole beneficiary. There was a beat of silence. What? Evelyn kept her voice calm. He updated it 8 months ago. Removed me completely. The entire payout goes to you now.
Sarah s'abstraitait.
I had no idea. You've also received over $180,000 from the foundation in the last year. Through your education fund. What? That can't be right. I checked the statements myself. Sarah's mouth opened, then closed again. She looked like a child caught in a lie, but Evelyn couldn't yet tell if that was guilt or shock. I swear I didn't know about that, Sarah said. I mean, I saw the balance change, but I thought it was just Dad moving some money around. For school. I didn't question it. You didn't question a 6-figure deposit? Evelyn asked. I'm not. I didn't look that closely, Sarah said. I don't check it every week.
Evelyn leaned forward. Sarah, listen to me.
Your father is planning something. He forged signatures.
Et rerouted foundation money.
He faked your grandfather's death. Sarah stared at her. What are you talking about?
Frédéric Artiselive.
I saw him. I spoke with him. Sarah's face turned pale. But, we had a funeral. We buried him.
No. Oui burier Ali.
And I need to know if you're part of it.
Sarah stood up.
You think I'm part of this? I think you've been close to both of them, your father and Grace, and you haven't asked the questions you should have. That makes you vulnerable, Sarah. Maybe even complicit.
Sarah's voice trembled.
I'm not part of anything. I didn't know about the money. I didn't know about Grandpa. I thought they were helping me. I thought Dr. Monroe was investing in my future. Evelyn stood too. She may be. Or she may be using you. Why would she do that?
Because she wants something your father promised her.
And if he can't give it to her willingly, he might be planning something far worse.
Sarah backed away, eyes glassy. Dis si sincère.
No, Evelyn said quietly. It's real. And I need you to be honest with me, Sarah. From now on. About everything.
No more hiding. No more pretending.
Sarah was silent. Then slowly, she walked over to her backpack and pulled out a flash drive. I didn't know what this was, she said. But I copied it off Dad's laptop 2 weeks ago. It was just there.
Labeled Legacy.
I was curious. Evelyn took it from her gently. Have you looked at it?
Sarah shook her head.
I was afraid. Evelyn placed the flash drive on the table and wrapped her arms around her daughter. For a long moment, they stood there, 2 women in a quiet house, surrounded by things they hadn't said.
I'm not mad, Evelyn whispered.
I just need you to help me fix this. Help me stop it before it gets worse. Sarah nodded into her shoulder. That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, Evelyn sat at her desk and inserted the flash drive into her computer. It was a folder of recordings. Audio files. She clicked the first one. Frederick's voice played through the speakers, old but steady.
Richard want full control.
He doesn't care who he burns.
He won't sign anything else.
He's going to fake it if he has to. Evelyn listened, her chest tightening with each word. This was it. Proof.
The silence had broken.
And now the truth had a voice. It began with a name scrawled in ink. Evelyn didn't expect to find anything that day. She was only at the Monroe Writing Center to observe, to stand in the shadows. Grace was holding a public lecture for visiting graduate students, and Sarah had invited Evelyn as a silent guest. I thought maybe it would help, Sarah had said. Seeing her. Listening. Evelyn had hesitated, then agreed. She sat in the back of the auditorium, careful not to draw attention. Grace stood at the front, commanding without effort, her voice smooth and thoughtful as she spoke about narrative structure and emotional resonance. She wore a slate gray blazer over a white blouse, her hair pinned back. Her presence hadn't changed. She still carried herself like someone who knew where the weight of the room was and how to control it. Evelyn felt anger stir in her chest, not loud or vengeful, but slow-burning and deep. Grace spoke about truth in storytelling, about how characters are shaped not by what happens to them but by what they choose to hide. It felt deliberate. After the lecture, Sarah rushed to the front with a few classmates. Evelyn stayed behind, waiting until the crowd thinned. Then, when no one was watching, she slipped down the side hallway, past the office door labeled Dr. Grace Monroe. It wasn't locked. Evelyn stepped inside. The office was neat but personal. Framed quotes lined the walls, photographs of past students and retreats scattered across the desk. A leather-bound journal lay open, half buried beneath a stack of printed manuscripts. It wasn't snooping, Evelyn told herself. Not really. She glanced at the page. The handwriting was familiar, small, deliberate cursive. Just a few lines. I still remember the day she walked away from me. It was quiet.
No storm. No epalegi.
Just a door that closed and never opened again. Evelyn froze. She reached for the journal. It was heavier than it looked, filled from cover to cover. A lifetime of thoughts. The entries weren't dated in order. Some were older, memories from youth. Others were more recent. The most recent pages held words that chilled her. She kissed me once, and then called it confusion. I let her go because I believed her. But I never forgot. I thought I would forgive her. Maybe I even did. But then I saw what she had, this picture-perfect life, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was the price she paid to buy it. Evelyn sat down in the leather chair, turning pages more quickly now. When Richard offered his help, it felt like fate. I knew who he was. I knew what he wanted. And I also knew what he feared. He feared losing control. That made him easy. She was still beautiful when I saw her at the funeral. But she didn't look strong. Not like I remembered. She looked tired. Comfortable. She won't see it coming. Evelyn felt a chill creep up her spine. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't even just an affair. It was a plan. One that had started long before Richard ever entered Grace's life again. She kept reading. If I can take the life she built, piece by piece, maybe I'll finally stop hearing her voice in my head. Maybe I'll stop wanting something I was never allowed to name. Evelyn closed the journal, her hands shaking. Grace had orchestrated this. From the beginning. Maybe she hadn't expected Richard to fall so easily into her orbit. Maybe she hadn't planned to use Sarah. But once the opportunity appeared, she took it. And now, Evelyn understood, the affair wasn't an accident, or even purely emotional. It was calculated. A narrative written long ago, fueled by pain and pride. And Evelyn had been the antagonist in Grace's mind the entire time. She slipped the journal into her bag. It wasn't stealing. It was survival. She left the office, heart pounding, and found Sarah waiting outside, still chatting with classmates. Ready to go? Evelyn asked, voice steady. Sarah smiled. What did you think? It was illuminating. They drove home in silence. Evelyn kept glancing at the journal in her bag, feeling the weight of it. This wasn't just evidence. It was motive. It was context. Back in her study that night, she read the entire journal again. There were moments that felt painfully sincere. Memories of late nights at the writing retreat. Of a kiss by the lake. Of heartbreak that never quite healed. But there were also entries that blurred the line between longing and obsession. She said she didn't mean to hurt me. But silence is a kind of violence too. She built a family. I built a legacy. Now let's see which one lasts. And finally, an entry written in darker ink, underlined. If I can't have peace, I'll settle for control. And if she ever learns the truth, well, maybe it's time she knows what it feels like to be powerless. Evelyn closed the journal and leaned back in her chair. The truth wasn't simple anymore. Richard was guilty, of theft, of deception, of betrayal. But Grace was something else entirely. Not just a scorned lover. A strategist. A woman who had waited 3 decades for the right moment to strike. And Evelyn had given her the opening. She looked around the room, at the framed photos of her and Richard, of Sarah as a child, of birthdays and anniversaries. All of it felt distant now. Like props from a story she no longer recognized. She reached for her recorder and began speaking, her voice calm. Grace Monroe entered my life 34 years ago. I thought I'd buried that part of myself. I thought silence was safety. But I see now that silence gave her power. She waited, and when the moment came, she took everything I had taught myself to treasure. She paused. But she miscalculated one thing. Evelyn's voice sharpened. I'm no longer afraid of who I was. Or what I left behind. I know her now, not just as the girl I once loved, but as the woman who came back to destroy me. She turned off the recorder and stood, her mind clearer than it had been in weeks. Grace had written a story. But Evelyn was ready to write the ending. Evelyn stood in the center of the study, surrounded by the pieces of her unraveling life, the forged grant documents, the insurance records, the secret audio files from Frederick, and now Grace's journal, a confession written in cursive, as if that softened its intent. Each item was a thread, and she was finally seeing the whole tapestry. But there was one piece missing, one that hadn't fully made sense yet. The money was real. The betrayal was real. Grace's motive was personal. But Evelyn had lived long enough beside powerful men to know when something didn't add up. And what didn't add up was Frederick. He had presented himself as the victim. The old man wronged by his ambitious son, sidelined, silenced, exiled. But the more Evelyn thought about it, the more she began to question his version of the story. She needed clarity. She needed the original documents, the unaltered will, the board agreements, the foundation bylaws. And she knew where to find them. The next morning, Evelyn drove back to Greenfield Assisted Living. This time, she wasn't nervous. She wasn't there to ask questions. She was there to confirm answers. Frederick was waiting in the common room, sitting in the same chair, wearing the same cardigan. His expression was unreadable. You're early, he said. I didn't want to waste time, she replied, setting down her bag. You said you had a copy of the original will. Ido. Then I want to see it. All of it. Not just the summary. Every clause. Frederick arched an eyebrow. That's a very specific request. I'm done being vague, Evelyn said. He studied her, then gave a short nod. Come with me. They moved to a private lounge at the end of the hall. Frederick pulled out a locked case from beneath a pile of blankets. Inside were papers, meticulously preserved, labeled, signed, notarized. She read through each page, scanning for familiar names, dates, signatures. Then she saw it. The original will did, in fact, name 3 beneficiaries, Richard, Evelyn, and Grace. But there was a 4th name. A silent trustee. Frederick Hart. She looked up. You retained legal oversight. Even after supposedly retiring. I did, he said calmly. Standard practice. I wanted to ensure continuity. No, Evelyn said. You wanted to maintain control. This was never about legacy. This was about leverage. Frederick didn't flinch. What's your point? You told me Richard forged your signature. That he forced you into retirement. But these documents say otherwise. You retained your power long after stepping down. You were still co-signing accounts 6 months ago. His eyes narrowed. I did what I had to do to protect what I built. No, Evelyn said, voice sharp now. You did what you always do. You manipulated the people around you to serve your own agenda. Just like you did when you convinced Richard to marry me instead of Grace. Just like you did when you faked your death. Frederick leaned back. I had to disappear. Richard was getting reckless. Or maybe, Evelyn said, you needed a clean exit. One that preserved your image while letting you pull strings from the shadows. He didn't deny it. Evelyn pressed on. You wanted Grace involved in the foundation again. That's why you included her in the will. You thought she'd be loyal. You didn't count on her wanting revenge. She's smarter than I gave her credit for, Frederick muttered. She played all of us, Evelyn said. But you gave her the tools. For a moment, Frederick looked genuinely tired. Then he said, you still have time to make this right. Make what right? You're the only person left that Richard and Grace both underestimated. If you come forward with the evidence, the board might reinstate you. You could dissolve Richard's control. Stop the hemorrhaging. And what do you get? A clean ending, he said. And a story I can still control. Evelyn stared at him, suddenly seeing him not as a victim, not even as a villain, but as a man who had lived too long in rooms full of mirrors. Always pulling the strings. Always believing that without him, the show would collapse. She stood. I'll do what needs to be done, she said. But not for you. He smiled faintly. You sound just like your mother-in-law. Evelyn froze. I never knew her, she said quietly. She didn't fit the mold either, Frederick said. She was sharp. Quieter than you, but no less dangerous when cornered. Evelyn left without another word. Back at home, she called a lawyer, someone outside the family network, someone clean. She scheduled an appointment to discuss power of attorney transfers, asset protection, and the legal implications of a forged death certificate. Then she returned to her study and reviewed the files again. She began compiling a dossier, labeled, indexed, annotated. She included the grant paperwork, the insurance policies, the journal excerpts, the audio files. She added a cover letter addressed to the Hart Foundation Board. And one more to the State Attorney General's office. It was time to bring this into the light. That night, Richard came home late again. He looked exhausted, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder, his tie loosened. Long day, he said, dropping his keys. Dinner's in the oven, Evelyn replied, not looking up from her notes. He approached, watching her for a moment. You've been working on something. Just cleaning house. He smiled faintly. You always kept this place running better than I did. She stood and faced him. You don't have to pretend anymore. Richard's smile faltered. Evelyn stepped closer. I know everything, Richard. The forged documents. The insurance policy. The money you funneled through Sarah's account. I've seen the real will. I've spoken to your father. And I've read Grace's journal. He opened his mouth. Closed it. This isn't a confrontation, Evelyn said. It's a notice. I'm giving you one chance. Come clean to the board. Resign. Walk away. Richard's face hardened. You don't have the authority. I do now, she said. As of this afternoon, I've been reinstated as an executive trustee, with oversight granted by the surviving founder. He blinked. Frederick is tired of watching you burn his legacy. They stood in silence. Finally, Richard said, You don't want to do this. I already did. He stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked out of the room. Evelyn exhaled slowly. Upstairs, she found Sarah sitting at the foot of her bed, holding Grace's journal. I read it, Sarah said. Evelyn sat beside her. I didn't know what she was carrying, Sarah whispered. All those years. Neither did I. She loved you. She thought she did. Sarah looked at her mother. Are you going to expose her? Yes, Evelyn said. But not to hurt her. To stop her. Before she becomes the very thing she thinks she's fighting against. Sarah nodded. And for the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest. Not anger. Not fear. Resolve. The story was shifting. And this time, she was the one writing it. 3 weeks later, the morning news broke with a headline that stopped Evelyn mid-step as she walked past the kitchen television. Richard Hart, former foundation director, found dead in holding cell, authorities investigating possible suicide. Her coffee cup slipped from her fingers and shattered against the floor. She barely heard it. The screen showed footage of the detention center downtown, swarming with reporters, yellow tape stretched across the gates. Richard Hart was being held pending an investigation into embezzlement, insurance fraud and forgery, the anchor was saying. Officials report he was found unresponsive in cell 42 early this morning. No signs of forced entry. No note was found. Evelyn didn't move. Her heart pounded, not with grief, not even with shock, but with a numb disbelief that felt like silence pressing into her lungs. It wasn't supposed to end this way. She had spent weeks building the case. She'd handed over documents to the board, sent her evidence to the state attorney's office, and spoken, on record, to auditors and investigators. The pressure had mounted quickly, and once the forged documents and financial discrepancies were confirmed, Richard had been arrested. He'd been out on bail for 2 days before being taken into custody again after new charges surfaced related to the foundation's shell accounts. And now he was dead. The official statement called it a suicide. But Evelyn didn't believe that. Not fully. She drove to the detention center that afternoon and asked to speak with the warden. It took nearly an hour of waiting before she was allowed into a small administrative office, where a tired, heavy-set man in a tan uniform sat across from her. "I was his wife," she said quietly. "I just want the truth." The warden hesitated. "All I can tell you is what's in the report." "Tell me anyway." He sighed. "Your husband was alone in his cell. Surveillance footage shows no one entered or exited between midnight and 6 a.m. When the guards did their rounds, they found him hanging by his bedsheet. No note. No evidence of foul play, officially. Unofficially." The warden looked at her for a long time. Unofficially? He was calm. Cooperative. Kept to himself. Not the type to unravel. Especially not this fast. Evelyn sat back in her chair, the pieces clicking together. Richard had been cornered, but he hadn't lost control, at least not publicly. He hadn't denied everything. In fact, during the last meeting with the foundation board, he had almost looked relieved. Like part of him was glad it was over. So why would he take his own life? Unless he didn't. Evelyn's thoughts turned sharply. Grace. She hadn't spoken to her since the foundation board met. Since the reinstatement. Since Grace's programs had been suspended pending investigation into the misuse of funds. The writing center had closed its doors for restructuring. Grace had disappeared from public view, issuing only a brief statement to the press about her deep sorrow and her desire to focus on healing and reflection. But Evelyn knew better. She drove home in a fog, the silence of her house now louder than ever. Richard's absence felt both empty and sharp, like a picture frame knocked off the wall but not yet picked up. She sat in the study, staring at the files she had once believed were her ammunition. Now they were a eulogy. Her phone buzzed. A blocked number. She let it ring once. Twice. Then answered. "I didn't expect it to end like this," came the voice on the other end. "Grace." Evelyn didn't speak. "I wanted accountability," Grace said. "Not tragedy. But I suppose some men don't know how to live without control." "You think he did it?" Evelyn asked. A pause. "I think he saw the walls closing in. And I think he chose the only door left." Evelyn's throat tightened. "Or someone opened that door for him." "You're asking if I killed him?" "I'm asking if you were still playing a game I hadn't caught up to yet." Grace's voice was calm. "I stopped playing the moment you exposed everything. I had what I came for. And then I lost it." "Not enough to let him live?" "I don't know what he chose," Grace said. "But I know he didn't choose you. And maybe, in the end, that's what hurt the most." Evelyn's hand trembled around the phone. "I read your journal," she said. "You wanted power. Control. You wanted me to feel what you felt 30 years ago." "I wanted to be seen," Grace said quietly. "You walked away like I was nothing. And you got to build a perfect life while I spent decades trying to forget." "I didn't forget," Evelyn said. "I just survived." There was silence on the other end. "I didn't kill him," Grace said finally. "But I didn't stop him, either. If that makes me guilty, so be it." Then the line went dead.
Evelyn sat in the quay.
Later that evening, Sarah came home. She had been staying with a friend near campus, trying to keep some distance from the fallout. Evelyn hadn't told her the news yet. When Sarah stepped into the kitchen and saw her mother's face, she knew. "He's gone," she whispered. Evelyn nodded.
Sarah sat down slowly.
"Did he do it?" she asked. "I don't know," Evelyn said. "But he's gone, and nothing will ever feel quite clean again." Sarah wiped her eyes. "I didn't want this." "Neither did I." They sat in silence. After a while, Evelyn got up and retrieved Grace's journal. She held it out to her daughter. "I don't know if you should read all of it, but some of it might help you understand." Sarah took the journal, hesitated, then nodded.
Evelyn walked to the window, looking out into the darkness.
She thought about Richard, not the man he had become, but the boy he had once been. The man who had kissed her under autumn leaves, who had held her hand during childbirth, who had once made her laugh so hard she cried. He was gone.
Not just dead.
Lost. The truth hadn't saved him. And Evelyn was left holding the wreckage. But even in that wreckage, something stirred. Not peace, but space. A beginning. And the faintest promise that spring might still come. The garden had always been Richard's project. Evelyn remembered the first summer after they moved into the house, him kneeling in the dirt, sketching beds with string, ordering rare seeds from catalogues he read like novels. He had planted it all in neat rows, hydrangeas, roses, climbing clematis.
Précision and control, just like everything est touched.
After his death, she had let it go wild. She told herself it was grief, or fatigue, or simply logistics. But deep down, Evelyn knew it was something else, a quiet protest. A silent ceremony for everything she had tried to keep alive that had, in the end, chosen to wither anyway. But now, 6 weeks after the funeral no one attended, she was back in the garden with gloves on, hands in the dirt. Not to preserve what Richard had built, but to plant something of her own. Sarah watched from the porch, a mug of tea in her hands, the journal still beside her. She hadn't spoken about it in detail, Grace's writing, but she had read most of it. Evelyn could tell by the way her daughter's questions changed. "Do you think she ever loved him?" Sarah had asked one evening. "I think she loved what he gave her," Evelyn had answered. "But I don't think she ever stopped measuring him against what she lost." And Sarah hadn't asked who that was. Some truths didn't need to be spoken anymore. The press had moved on. The Hart Foundation had dissolved its executive board and was being restructured as a public trust, thanks in large part to Evelyn's testimony. The estate had been frozen, pending investigation into asset misappropriation, but Evelyn had protected Sarah's account. The money would go toward graduate school. Or a life far away from all of this. Evelyn had declined interviews. Declined the book offers. Declined the speaking engagements. What she had done, she hadn't done for spectacle. But she had written. Not a memoir. Not exactly. It was a novel.
Par fiction. Par confession. A story about a woman who loved and lost and loved again.
A woman who stayed silent for too long, and then spoke too late, but still just in time. The publisher had offered a modest advance. A first-time contract. Evelyn accepted with quiet satisfaction. Not because she needed the money, but because something inside her had needed to be heard. On a Thursday morning, she received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single page, handwritten in the same careful script she once knew by heart. "You won.
Or maybe you savais du sol.
I'm not sure there's a difference anymore. I've taken a teaching position in Portland.
À différents costs. À différents kind of silence.
Tell Sarah she has the gift. And tell yourself you did what none of us could. You stayed. And then you left. I hope that gives you peace. G." Evelyn folded the letter once and set it in the drawer beside her bed. She didn't cry. She didn't smile.
She simply exhaled.
Later that week, she and Sarah drove to the coast. The ocean was gray and windswept, but the cold air felt clean, untangled from the weight of what they'd survived. They walked without speaking for a long time. Then Sarah asked a question that had lingered between them for months. "Was it real? What you felt for her?" Evelyn nodded. "Yes. It was real." "Why didn't you stay with her?" Evelyn thought about it. Because I was afraid. And because I thought I had to choose between truth and a life that made sense.
Do you regret it?
Sometimes, she said. But if I hadn't chosen the life I did, I wouldn't have had you. Sarah slipped her arm through her mother's and leaned her head against her shoulder. Do you think she'll ever come back? No, Evelyn said. But not everyone needs to.
That night, back at the house, Evelyn sat on the back porch, a blanket over her leg, watching the star blink into the sky.
The air smelled of earth and new blossoms. The first daffodils had broken through the soil, stubborn in their insistence that winter was over. She opened her notebook and wrote a single line. I thought the story ended with him. But it didn't. It ended with me choosing to begin again. And she meant it. For the first time in her life, Evelyn Hart wasn't writing to be understood. She was writing because she had nothing left to hide. The past had burned. But in its ashes, something quiet and resilient was beginning to grow.
Not forgiveness.
Not forgetfulness. But clarity.
And maybe, in time, peace.
In the end, it wasn't about winning or losing, betrayal or revenge. It wasn't about who loved whom first, or best, or most painfully. It was about a woman who remembered her voice, and then used it. A woman who looked at the ruins of what had been and didn't flinch. Who stepped into the garden, not to restore what was lost, but to plant something that could only bloom now. In truth.
In light.
In her own name.